benchmark 8A, we're going to solve this, and you should notice by looking at it that you're going to be square rooting both sides. Again, because if there's an x squared and no x's, you're going to get the x squared by itself and then square root both sides. So, like I said, you want to get the x squared by itself. So what we're going to do first is this minus the 4 over. I now have 5x squared equals 40. Okay. Now, to get the x squared completely by itself, you now have to divide the 5 off. If you divide both sides by 5, you get x squared equals 8. Now, 8 is not a perfect square. You can't just look at that and go, oh, that's blank. Because you don't know what squared gives you 8. It's not perfect. But how do you get rid of a square? You square root. It's the opposite of squaring. So from here, we're going to square root both sides. That leaves us with x equals. Now, when you square root both sides, there's a property where you have to put a plus or minus over here. Because your answer is either positive or negative square root 8. Now, most people might think they're done, but you have to check to see if you can simplify square root 8. And you can. Square root 8, what square number goes into 8? 4 times 2. And what do I mean by that? Well, what you have to realize is square root 4 is 2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2. Now, some of you are going to forget the plus or minus. I'm sorry. Don't. As much as you can. Don't forget it. And don't forget to reduce, if you can, the square root. This is a square root method, again, is when there's an x squared and no x's. Look at this one. Do you see we have x squared and x's? This one we're going to use factoring. Now, with the factoring type of problem, you need to set it equal to 0. Here you got the x squared by itself. Here you're setting it equal to 0. So what you're going to do first is let's move over the x's. So I now have x squared minus 8x equals 20. Oh wait, I still got to get over that 20. So let's minus the 20. And does 20 subtract from either of those? No. So I just I'm going to be subtracting it over here somewhere. So I end up with x squared minus the 8x and then just a minus 20 because 20 cannot subtract from x squared or x. So you just put it at the end. Okay. Now our next step is to factor this left side. So to factor, we make this little x thing. You put the negative 20 on top, the negative 8 on bottom, and we have to think about, okay, what two numbers multiply to get negative 20 and add to get negative 8? And hopefully you notice it's negative 10 and 2. So that would be x minus 10, x plus 2 equals 0. And from there, what you hopefully notice is that either this or this has to equal 0. So either x minus 10 has to equal 0 or x plus 2 has to equal 0. So what is all that saying? Well, what minus 10 gives you 0? Most of you can see that and say it's 10. If you can't see it, do you understand you just basically add 10 to both sides? And here, just minus the 2 over. Or instead of minusing 2 over, can some of you just notice negative 2 plus 2 gives you 0? There's my two answers. Now, any problem with an x squared tends to have two answers. It could have less than 2, meaning 1 or 0, but most of the time it will have 2, but it cannot have more than 2. So keep that in mind, that x squareds tend to have two answers, plus or minus here, and two answers here. Factoring type, where you set it equal to 0, square rooting both sides.